Very, very appropriate words. Nice to see you all again, and it's a pleasure for us to be here as well. Last time we were together, we had Sarah and Abraham leaving Ur, and we talked about all that life was like in that city at that time. Their travel to Haran, their travel into the land, only to find that there was famine in the land, and then so continue on down to Egypt. And then in Egypt, the terrible story of Abraham allowing Sarah to go into the harem of Pharaoh. And so that's where we pick up our story this evening. And so we left Sarah reunited with Abram after the shocking experience that she had of getting taken into Pharaoh's harem. It was a time that Abram had faltered, he had failed, and his faith had not been up to the task of what he was encountering in Egypt. And he hadn't done what the Apostle Peter had said that men should do. And the only area that we're going to go to apart from the Genesis record is going to be 1 Peter 3 just now. You can go there if you want. Otherwise, I'll just read out the sections. It'll be okay. And I asked Chris not to have a reading tonight because we've got a fair slab of scripture to get through this evening. And the stories, the basic stories we know, and most of it will be, I'll be reading parts out anyway. So, and if you're wondering about the translation I use a little bit of Message and a little bit of ESV, jumbles between the both. Okay, so 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7 says, be good husbands to your wives, honour them, delight in them. As women, they lack some of your advantages, but in the new life of God's grace, you're equals. And that's from the Message Bible. So to be heirs together, which is that quote in the King James, we must give honour and respect and ensure that we're walking together. And in the King James it says, with our weaker vessels. And so Abraham didn't do that at that time. He left her up to the scruples of the land, and which was a terrible situation. So Sarah had done her part well, though. And back in verse 6 of chapter 3 of 1 Peter, it says, Sarah, for instance, taking care of Abraham, would address him as my dear husband. You'll be true daughters of Sarah if you do the same, unanxious and unintimidated. We always emphasise that Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and so she did. She had respect for him. She had left Ur with him. She travelled huge kilometres with him. She lived in a tent with him, was put in jeopardy in Egypt with Pharaoh. She had always done what Abram had asked of her. And God here in Peter commends her for that. Whose children you are if you do the same. So that's one of the lessons there for us, and especially sisters, I guess, in modern times, that we submit to each other. And it also finishes there with unanxious and unintimidated. And I think that's really good considering what she's been through. She's been through a severely fearful time. That should never have happened, and it was a time that was at the hands of her husband, really. And so she obviously kept her head in that time. She kept her heart in that time through that tremendous ordeal. Was she to blame for any of it? Well, there's no blame associated from God to her for that time in Egypt. Her only crime is really having good looks and her beauty, which is no crime at all, really. Good looks are sometimes a problem, can be a problem. Perhaps a lack of character development, perhaps shallowness, perhaps lack of dependence on God, perhaps our over-reliance and self-confidence in ourselves. But good looks and these kind of characteristics don't have to go hand in hand at all. And good looks weren't a problem to Sarah. As we said last time, she had very good looks, but there is no hint that she ever used those good looks at all. And if we think about where she was, Egyptian beauty was different to Chaldean beauty. So Egyptians were either made up with lots of makeup and very pale, or the southern Egyptians were more African in appearance and quite darker skin. So her with her natural olive skin, as the Chaldeans had, would have stood out quite a bit. And I guess women who are good looking have to realise that this is a gift from God, like any other gift from God that we might have, and we have to still develop spiritually and rely more on inner beauty. And that's the lesson from here. We probably all know people who are perhaps even not the most striking beauty, but there is something about them that we find really, really attractive. And we see those people and their beauty shines out. And it doesn't come along very often that you get this person whose beauty shines out from inside and radiates. And it's really quite a nice thing when it does happen. Sarah happened to have both. She was a striking beauty and she had beauty of character. And remember, it said of her that she was wholly beautiful. So if we were to go back to the start of 1 Peter chapter 3, Peter really picks up on this and says, well, the same goes for you wives. Be good wives to your husbands, responsive to their needs. There are husbands who, indifferent as they are to any of the words about God, will be captivated by your life of holy beauty. What matters is not your outer appearance, the styling of your hair, the jewellery you wear, the cut of your clothes, but your inner disposition. Cultivate inner beauty, the gentle, gracious, kind that God delights in. The holy women of old were beautiful before God that way, and were good, loyal wives to their husbands as well. And then it says Sarah, for instance. So Peter is particularly picking Sarah out of the whole Bible record to say that was her. She was gracious, gentle, kind. And we know that God looks on the heart. And men who are godlike will also look on the heart. She shone from the inside. Okay, so chapter 13. There's some chapters tonight that we're just going to skip through fairly quickly. Chapter 13 is one of them. In verse 1 of Genesis chapter 13, we have the story of where it says, Abraham went up out of Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him into the Negev. So they escaped Egypt with their lives. Sarah is now elevated to number 2 because previously Lot is always mentioned before her. So she is now above Lot in that sense here. And then in verse 2 it says, now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver and in gold. And we know where he got that from because the previous chapter said that Pharaoh gave him all of that. And servants, men and women servants as well. So a lot of that wealth came from Pharaoh, and we could say that they're ill-gotten gains. And some of them he would have been better without, as we're going to go and find out later on. So he journeyed on from the Negev as far as to Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai. And so he's leaving Egypt. He's travelling north. He goes through the Negev and he gets to Bethel, which means the house of God, to the altar that he had built on the way down through the land. This is just north of Jerusalem. It's a 320-kilometre trek. So he's well leaving Egypt. He's putting Egypt way behind him. He perhaps learned his lesson with Egypt. And in fact, he never leaves the land again after that. We know that he heads down to Philistine area, but he never leaves Canaan as such from this time forward, and neither does his son Isaac. So he seems to be rid of Egypt. But their tribe now is very big, and he has to part company with Lot. And as we know, Lot chooses the well-watered plains, a disastrous decision. And Abraham must have been sad about that, because God reaches out to him in verse 14 of that chapter and says, after Lot had separated from him, "Lift your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward, and all the land which you see I will give you and your offspring forever." So Abram has made the right choice concerning Lot. He allowed Lot, which in his kindness, which was good, to have first pick of the land. And God treasures him with this third promise. And this time it is about a land, and is to look northward, southward, eastward, and westward. This is not a circle. This is northward, southward, eastward, and westward. It's a bit odd. And it's funny, we actually say that these days. It's the same, but it's a bit odd. But he's ending up with his back towards, if we think about it, Bethel's just up here, and Lot has just gone down to the well-watered plains down in here. And if he's facing west at the end of that promise, look northward, southward, eastward and westward, he's got his back to Lot. And so there's this deliberate thing that he's facing away from Sodom, and he's got to think about something else. And the something else is the rest of the promise. This seed that he would have, the offspring, because he goes on to talk about that, and he would be thinking, oh yeah, another promise of a son coming. But time's marching on, remember, and the years are going by, and Sarah, who was barren, is still barren. So Abram moved his tent from there and came and settled in Hebron, and Hebron is more down here, up there, on those mountains just there. Verse 18 says, so Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, where he built an altar to the Lord. So Abram and Sarah now turn their backs on Sodom and on Lot. And remember, Lot is her brother. And he's now in the lowest city of the land, and they head to the highest city of the land, Hebron, which means fellowship, the highest part of the land. And that 3D map there doesn't show it really well, but you have to believe me on that one. So Hebron also is the second most sacred city in Israel. It's important to Judaism, to Christianity, and to Islam. And Ben-Gurion once said, it is more Jewish than Jerusalem. Jerusalem became Jewish 3,000 years ago under King David, but Hebron became Jewish 4,000 years ago under Abraham. And it's still very, very hotly sought after piece of land today. There's lots of fighting that goes on about that place. And in fact, Hebron is split in two, H1 and H2. I don't know which one's which, but one of them is Jewish and one of them is Palestinian. So such an important place. It became Sarah's happy place later. We'll see that she comes back to Hebron. She seems to like Hebron. So that's it there in earlier last century times. It was the first place that was bought by a Hebrew. So remember, Abraham had to buy the cave of Machpelah to bury Sarah. and the caves of Machpelah are evidently inside of that, or underneath that, which is a building that Herod built in the time of Christ. It was also important because this was one of the places that the 12 spies came to, and it's near Eshcol, where the grapes were, and that's why that stamp is there. It was a city of refuge. It became the first city that David reigned from as king, and so there's actually coins that were produced with Hebron on them. And it was the place to buy sacrifices from. Evidently they had the best lambs there. So it was a fairly fertile place, and that's where they went. So then we go to chapter 14, and chapter 14 is the rescuing of Lot, and there's a big battle, we know, that happens, and Abraham gathers 318 of his men, which shows you the size of the tribe that they had. So it's not just this tiny little camp, it's almost like a total village that they've got, a portable village, and 318 men go and chase after the kings, and they actually travel a huge amount of distance and get Lot back. He also meets Melchizedek at this time, and time is still slipping away. And all along the way, Abram is the one that has the props to his faith. God speaks to him, and with his meeting with Melchizedek, Melchizedek blesses him. God appears to Abram, and even though they're all years apart, and we think, well, Abraham had to last years before God speaks to him again, they're still stepping stones. They might be a long way apart, but they are stepping stones. Sarah had none of this. There was nothing to her like that at all. There was nothing. And she may even be wondering if some of this is even Abram's imagination. She's completely on her own. But we know, of course, that Abram would have filled her in on all the things that were happening and told her about them all. But there's nothing for her apart from that. And if we think about it, true faith, true trust, belief and obedience is when you have nothing at all to go on and you still believe and you still have faith and you still trust God. That's Sarah. So then chapter 15, 5 years later, time is still ticking by, and Abraham gets the fourth promise, another intervention from God, but this time it was a vision. And this time there is a dialogue that happens between Abraham and God. There's this conversation. And verse 1 of chapter 15 says, "After these things the word of the Lord came to Abram and said, 'Fear not, Abraham, I'm your shield, your reward shall be very great.'" So here we have Abraham getting this reassurance from God. And Abraham must have been a little worried or a little scared or something, because for God to say, "Fear not," that usually happens when somebody's fearing. And I'm your shield, your reward. And obviously Abraham needed that at the time. And I guess we need to soak that in as well, because we often think that these Bible characters are just fantastic heroes of faith all the time. And we just read the New Testament summaries of them, father of the faithful, and think, oh yes, he had it all. But there was obviously great times where that wasn't the case. There was times where they were worried, or they were not up to thinking great things and just relying on God and relying on faith. It's good to know that they were mortals just like us, and that they didn't just breeze through life, because life, as we know, is hard, and they had it hard too. And Abram's still childless, and is concerned in this chapter 15 that perhaps God should work through Eliezer, the servant heir of his house, is what he's trying to say. And he's not afraid to speak his mind to God and say, well, this is a good idea. And probably Abram had been thinking that Lot, he could have an heir through Lot, but now Lot has parted from him. And he's looking around and thinking, well, Eliezer, and the word for steward that Eliezer means acquired son. And so in his mind, he's thinking, well, perhaps Eliezer is the one. Perhaps God can work through him. But God says to him in verse 4 of chapter 15, this man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir. And he brought him outside and he said, look towards heaven and number the stars. If you're able to number those stars, so shall your offspring be. So his offspring now would shine like the stars. Before it was dust. Chapter 22, it's sand. But here it's stars. And I think that's fantastic because this is so much more spiritual. When we look up at the stars even, we are caused to think spiritually, and that's what God is doing right here. On a clear night, a few weeks ago we went up to Waikerie, and just the amount of stars up there compared to what we can see here is amazing. And God's saying, have a good look at those stars. Because dust can shift. Sand can shift. But stars, apart from the fact that we're in the southern hemisphere and they're in the northern hemisphere, the stars are there still. They're eternal. And that's what God was trying to tell Abram here. And verse 6 says, and Abram believed the Lord and he counted it to him for righteousness. So after this fearful time, he's bolstered to continue on. So there is this assurance and this sharing of this big moment together. And God invites him to a meal. They have a meal and they make a covenant together. And so we know that the coming of faith is a slow distilling process, isn't it? It's not something that just happens overnight. It's not something that we have right from the beginning and that faith continues on steadfast to the end. It waxes and wanes. It builds and grows slowly. And poor Sarah, all this time, still, Abram would have conveyed all of this to her. Imagine how excited he would have been after chapter 15 and seeing all that and hearing all that from God. He would have got home so excited. And they would have, as Harry Tennant's always said that good husbands do, talk and talk and talk. And he would have talked all about it. A son from me, a seed as the stars innumerable. Imagine that, amazing. And he would have said all that. But what's missing in all of that is, oh, and you too. It's just not there, is it? There's been nothing yet about her. And she would have looked at those stars too and probably went out at night that night. She knows she's still barren. She knows this has always been a problem. It was the caption of her life in chapter 11. And this is her problem. How can she fix it? She's 76 years old now. She's been married for 45 years. They've been 10 years out of the land, and there's still no child. There's nothing that can help this promise. And her heart would have been tearing away at her, and her faith would have been ebbing as well. And this is the segue directly into chapter 16, which becomes the real low point in Sarah's life, where she takes things into her own hands and tries to fix things herself, which became a complete disaster. And it shows that both of them, both Abraham, as we saw last week, and her this time, still have so much to learn. They're still growing. So even at 76, she's still a babe when it comes to faith. So she doesn't know it yet. Okay, sorry, I thought I was a bit lost, but I'm... My notes aren't lost, just my brain. So Sarah doesn't know it yet, but she is about to sell her soul and put her husband into the arms of another woman. And this is the centre point of the whole story of the Abram and Sarah story. So what you have on the screen here is what was in your notes, and I apologise, I was supposed to bring some more notes tonight and I forgot. But it's in there, I'll bring some more next time. This is a chiastic structure. I guess most of you have heard of chiasms before, yeah? Some yeses, some noes. A chiasm is a Hebrew or a God way of putting something in the record in a pattern, so as you get an arrow or a point. And here, if we look at this and you read all of these and you get to a certain point where it starts to reverse and go backwards. So the first half of their life is up to here, and the second half is going off, and it's mirrored. So the mirror point in their story is right here, Hagar and Ishmael, and it's a really odd place to mirror it, because I would be thinking, well, if I had invented the chiasm, I would have probably put it at the birth of Isaac, which is right down the end. That would be the high point in their life. But the chiasm is pointing to the low point in their life, which is Hagar and Ishmael. And so the lesson that God is trying to put into this story is right there in chapter 16. And so that's what we're just going to have a quick look at now. And why would it be Hagar and Ishmael? Why is the chiasm pointing to there? What can we pull out of there? And I think the lesson we can pull out of there is a failure to wait for God. That's the lesson. So if we're people of faith, we're going to wait for God. And she's not waiting. She's going to try and do it her own way. So Sarah's faith this time shows signs of being unequal to the task that is waiting, or to the strains of life. So, verse 1 of chapter 16, Sarah had a female Egyptian slave whose name was Hagar. And Sarah said to Abram, "Behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant, and it may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarah. Now, this conversation had probably come up before, throughout their marriage. And it's really a mark of the love that both of them had for each other that Abram had not taken another wife already, because that was reasonably common practice back then. Today, of course, we think it's quite strange. Hagar would simply have been a surrogate mother, but Sarah deserves our sympathy at this point. We know from others in the Bible of complete scorn and reproach and sadness that women had for being not able to have a baby. So we have the story of Rachel with her sister Leah. We have the story of Hannah. We have the story of Elizabeth from the New Testament. So it was a big thing over a long span of time that women were able to have babies. And she would believe that this is more her problem than Abram's. So she's desperate for a son by any means. But again, there's no prayers here and there's no guidance from God. And she just seems to make up her mind that this is a good thing to do. And possibly it could have been if it wasn't Hagar. Because Sarah is saying there in verse 2, it may be that I may obtain children by her. And so the word there is children. It's not child, it's children. So she's not wanting a son, she's not wanting a child, she's wanting children. And it's the word that's also linked with building, to build a house. So this is more what she's thinking about. She's wanting to build the house of God. She's wanting to make sure that promise happens. It's not a single child she wants. She wants to build the house. It's plural. And she's thinking of the future. She was thinking of the man that was promised the world. And in some records it says that I may be builded by her. So the building starts from her. And it's really a reference to Christ as well. So this is what she's thinking. And for her, this is a spiritual decision she is making. She sees this as her part of fulfilling the promises to continue the seed of Abram. And it was truly a wonderful motive. But really, it's a terrible thing that she's thinking. And a woman today would never do this. To push your husband into the arms of another woman and not be scarred by that would take an enormous character. At the end of verse 2, and Abram listened to the voice of Sarah. Of course he listened. He's a man. And that's all I need to say about that. And it's very easy to make spiritual decisions when it appeals to our human nature as well. And it would have taken a really great man to be able to say no to that. So this is a really sad thing that Sarah is doing. In these days, it would have been more normal to accept than for us, because mistresses, as she was, had handmaids and their job was to serve them, and often their job was also to give birth for them as well. But they gave birth on the knees of the wife, so that it symbolises that the baby was the wife's. And the baby was passed on to the mistress, and the baby would become the mistress's, and the handmaid at best might be a nurse. That's how it should have happened, and that's what she's thinking will happen. But the sad thing is, that's not what Hagar's thinking. And human emotion is often the same the whole world over. And he went into Hagar and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. Welcome to the family. Hagar the Egyptian. She's not a very nice person. She was one of the spoils from Pharaoh, another leftover problem of Abraham's mistake earlier on. And when God tells us something repeatedly over and over again, we have to listen. She is always mentioned as Hagar the Egyptian. Here in verse 1, verse 3, chapter 21, chapter 25, Hagar the Egyptian, Hagar the Egyptian. She despises Sarah and wants to replace her as Abraham's wife. And the word there is wife, Isha. And she wants to become the heir to the chieftain family. And that's where her mind's at. And Sarah realises this now too well as well, that she has made her own giant mistake. So lesson number 1 for her was that her motive was right and pure, but she was not wanting to continue waiting for God. And we, brothers and sisters, have to learn, and it's probably one of the hardest things of our life to learn, that we have to wait for God, because God's timing is way different to our timing. And we tend to want things now, but we have to learn to wait. And that requires patience, and that requires us to stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. And it's a hard thing. We can't orchestrate things ourselves. Maybe there was a little bit of the Jacobness in here, maybe not. And the lesson number 2 for her is that the end never justifies the means. So whether good motives or not, the end does not justify us taking things into our own hands. No good will ever come of us fixing problems with our own way. We can't criticise her motives. She had tremendous ability to see the big picture far into the future and see her children as the stars of heaven. And so she says to Abram in verse 5, "It's all your fault that I'm suffering this abuse. I put my maid in bed with you, and the minute she knows she's pregnant, she treats me like I'm nothing." May God decide which of us is right. And that's a very good translation, that Message version there, because that's exactly what she's saying. And there's a lot in this verse. And at first glance, some of us men might be thinking, well, we could have seen that coming a mile away. Isn't that just like a woman changing her mind? Or, this is just jealousy talking here, get over yourself. But this is not what it's about at all. And the clue is the last bit, which says, may God decide which of us is right. She's actually calling on God here to be the judge of who's done the right thing and who hasn't. And this is a big thing. And she knows that she was right. And she's calling on God to make that judgment. Sarah is now seeing clearly and seeing that perhaps Abram's intentions weren't quite the same as hers through the whole process. She's really saying, I know why I did this, but I'm not sure why you did this. And these are really strong words, and she is right, and she's picked up in the New Testament, which we'll look at in a fortnight's time, for saying this at this time. So this is not just something I'm taking out of, stretching something here. This is picked up in the New Testament as something really important. But Abram said to Sarai, behold, your servant is in your power. Do as you please with her. Then Sarah dealt harshly with her and she fled. So Abraham's response is exactly the response that would have been in the day. I don't think he's trying to pass the buck at all. What he's really saying is, she is your handmaid, and she was. You do as you please. And the word please there is really a word that means do what is good. That's actually not a good translation, that one. So do what is good. And what he's trying to say to her, just do it properly, which she actually didn't do, because she dealt harshly with her and she fled. So Hagar does flee, and her name means flight. Perhaps she was a flighty person, and off she flew. And she goes and she heads back towards the wilderness of Shur, which is back towards Egypt. She's trying to head home, and she's got to get through the wilderness of Shur. It's a pretty bad place down there. But God finds her, and he blesses her, and he tells her to go back and to give it another chance, which she does. But ultimately, this doesn't help. She didn't allow herself to be moulded and shaped by God. So wilderness of Shur is just there. So she's heading down here. So from Hebron, which is up about there, she's heading down there. Okay. Now Hagar's a bit like Saul, I think, a person you sort of feel sorry for, but we probably shouldn't, because she's given every opportunity. She is helped by God. She is specifically helped twice by God with God's divine intervention, twice, which is more than what Sarah got. It's pretty amazing. She's in the right house. She's in the house of God. She's with the right family. She's in the right influence. She has everything going for her to succeed. But she just doesn't change, and she just doesn't develop, and she doesn't get spiritual or godly. It's sad, really, that it just never took off for her. But that's the person that she was, and I guess that's why God calls her the Egyptian. And through all of our life's ups and downs, we have to make sure that, especially sisters, that we're more Sarahs than Hagars. That we do allow change to happen, and we do allow spiritualness to affect our life and our choices. We make choices every single day, and those choices have to be choices of God. And You have to make sure that you're standing behind the right woman in this story. And so Ishmael is born, and between chapters 16 and 17 is another 13-year gap. And so time has slipped by quite a lot. 13 more years of silence. The child begins to grow. So this is the birth here, showing the birth here. But life continues on, and Ishmael grows up. And as we head to Genesis 13, Abram is now 99. Sarah is 89. Patience has taken its toll again, and they're now learning to wait for God, and this is a good thing. So chapter 17 is the fifth promise, and again God appears to Abram and talks to him. And we don't want to spend much time here, but there is a couple of things we do have to take from chapter 17. The name changes are here. And verse 5, no longer shall your name be called Abram, but you shall be Abraham, for I've made you a father of many nations. And many nations includes us. So Australia is a nation, and he's the father of us here. And in this promise that's given in chapter 17, there's many I wills from God. I will, I will, I will. And this is in stark contrast with Abraham's total inability to do anything. So it's sort of like I will and you can't. I will and you can't. I will and you can't. And that's part of the lesson of their lives. Because the name changes here are a real turning point in their lives. And then in verse 15, this is a time we've all been waiting for. As for Sarah, your wife, you shall not call her Sarai, but Sarah shall her name be. I will bless her, and moreover I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of people shall come from her. So here it's very, very specific. Lots of hers and she's, and it's all about her. Then Abram fell on his face and laughed. And I want us to soak that in. He laughed. Because what kind of laugh is this? So finally what we see here, and after that, if you keep reading verse 17, it says, shall a child be born of a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? But finally here, we see that she's Sarah. And so Sarai was princess, but in a diminutive sense, probably like a bit of a my princess type of attitude. But here she's now a real princess, because Sarah does mean princess, but in the Hebrew it's a different word, and it's a noble woman. So it's literally a princess is what she's becoming. And the changes are the same as with Abram's name. There's an adding of a which is the single Hebrew letter that's pictured right here. Looking like that, looking like the blood on the doorposts and lintel. The H is added to both their names. It's also the number 5 in Hebrew, which is the number of grace. And it's as if Yahweh is breathing into their names. So Abram laughs here because he's doing the sums in his head, you know. But he's doing this in his heart. He's laughing in his heart, it says. Which is funny, because we always know, you know, when Isaac is born, we say, oh, it's laughter. Yeah, it's because she laughed in her heart in the tent. But But Abram here is laughing in his heart as he's talking to God. But what is he laughing at is a question I'd like to ask. He's laughing at the Sarah part. As soon as God says about Sarah, he fell on his face and he laughed. And I don't think it's a laugh of disbelief at all. Because in the New Testament, in Romans 4, it says he staggered not at the promise of God through unbelief. He staggered not. And in John 8 it says, your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad. So we've got a rejoicing, we've got a gladness, we've got this happiness, and we've got a laugh here. And I don't think it's a laugh of disbelief at all. I think it's a laugh because he's finally got it. This is the moment where he finally gets it, and it's sort of like this. I understand now, finally. I finally get it. It's not just me. It's got to include her as well. Her. It's about her as well. And I get it now. And it's just this laugh. As Abraham really now learns to lean on God. Abraham has learnt to leave it up to God. Sarah's now learnt to leave it up to God as well. And Abram's learnt that he doesn't need to know the detail. And I understand what this is all about. He's got to a stage of life that he doesn't need to have the detail. He doesn't need to know the working out and the hows and the whys and the why-fors and the wheres. If we're trusting God, we don't need any of that. And that's where Abraham is right here, right now, and he just laughs because he's accepting that he's just putting his hand in God's hand, and wherever God wants to lead him and whatever God wants to do, and however that's going to happen, he's just going to smile and accept it. And I think that's just such a beautiful point in life to get to, that stage where we don't have to struggle, we don't have to know the answers, we don't have to care about anything. We just smile, and not smile and wave like the Madagascar penguins, but smile like Abraham and just accept, yes, God's going to do this somehow. I'm 100, she's 90. I don't know how you're going to do it, but somehow he falls and laughs. Because there's no other way to see that laughter. It's in no way a laughter of disbelief. I believe this is true faith. Right, that attitude of understanding that we just accept whatever's going to happen. That's true faith. And I think he's right there, right now. We know he had faith to leave Ur. We know he had faith to travel. We know he had faith to live in tents, but this is it. So, this promise and these name changes are the watershed moment. The time where they're at the pointy part of the world and the water's going off both sides, and he's there now. Sarah's not quite there yet, but he is. She's still a chapter away. And there's a little bit of a lesson in that for married couples, I think, because just because we're married doesn't mean we're at the same place at the same time. And because we all think different. And often we're at different stages of our learning journey. We're at different times, different paces, different places. And so we just have to accept that, and we have to roll with each other and work that out. Men and women are different. They process things differently. They have different strengths and weaknesses, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. And God has set that all in motion, and we're designed to complement each other that way, and so we should. And then in verse 19, it says, Sarah your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant, whom Sarah shall bear to you at that at this time next year. So Isaac, laughter. Is it from Sarah at the tent? No, that hasn't happened yet. Perhaps it's from Abram, right here, right now. And Sarah will bear you a child at this time next year. So Isaac shall be the one. And my covenant is mentioned 13 times in this chapter, and it's going to be through Isaac. And now that's important, and we'll talk about that next time. And where it says in Sarah at this time next year, Sarah now is becoming centre stage, isn't she? Because this changes everything. Before it was Abraham's son, and now we know it's through she, her, Sarah specifically. This is going to be her son. We've had the story so far spanning 6 chapters and 29 years. So we've gone through 6 chapters of her life, 29 years, but now what happens is we have 5 chapters that are all going to happen in the space of 1 year of their life. From this time on, the next 5 chapters all happen within 1 year. So this is really amazing. Because time has moved fairly rapidly for them up until now. So from chapter 17 to chapter 21 is almost in slow motion. And we talked about this last time. We said that, well, God, started the world and the creation and the whole flood and everything else, and there was all these big things happen, and then it stops. It's like God's turned over the page, and then we've got the story of Abraham and Sarah. And it slows right down to a family. And now it's like he's turned over the page again, and it's slowed right down, and we're just going to look at 1 year in their life. And so this is really quite amazing. And it's almost as if God is now focusing our whole attention on Sarah for the next 5 chapters. It slows down to show the matriarch of his people. And again, this is picked up in the New Testament we'll talk about next time. Okay, chapter 18, very important chapter. And so Sarah only gets one time with God, and it's right here now. Chapter 18 is an odd chapter as well, because the 2 angels and the Yahweh angel are on a mission to bring this news directly to Sarah. Now, I had always thought that they were on their way to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and they sort of took a detour to see Abraham. But it's actually the other way round. They were coming to see Sarah, and then after they leave, in verse 17 it tells us, they talk about whether they should tell Abraham about Sodom and Gomorrah. And so they really came. So they were coming to see her and to strengthen her. So both Abraham and Sarah begin this scenario not knowing that these visitors are angels, but there's a lot of supernatural stuff fairly quickly. And Yahweh appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. So Abraham's there, the heat of the day, sitting in his tent, and Yahweh appears. He lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing in front of him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself on the earth. So these 3 men just suddenly appear. And so there's something miraculous about this straight away, because we've got to remember their little village has got like 1,000 people in it. If there's 300 men, there's going to be 300 women. There's going to be 400 kids at least. There's going to be over 1,000 people there. And somebody would have said something, or there would have been a ruckus somewhere as these 3 visitors want to find the chieftain. But that doesn't happen. They're just suddenly there, standing in front of him. And Abram begins to prepare a feast. Now, in the Middle East, the idea is that every visitor is an honoured guest. And so they treat visitors as hugely important. The same word is used here 3 times. So Abraham is quickly, Sarah is quickly, and the servant is quickly. So there's this teamwork that's happening between them all as they all prepare this meal for the three strangers. They all worked to the same end. They all had the same goal in mind. And so a very generous meal was provided for the guests by Abram and Sarah. And the message from this, I guess, is that we too are to be lovers of hospitality and be ready to entertain strangers because they just may be angels unaware from us. That is, not unaware to themselves. So Sarah doesn't take over Abraham's job and Abraham doesn't take over hers. They just work together for this hospitality. And in Christ, we know that hospitality is a major part of our life as well, and we should do like they do in this particular spot. And then in verse 9 it says, Yahweh angel says, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" And he said, "She's in the tent." I think I really like this snapshot because it's really exactly what would have happened, because she's only been Sarah for a few weeks. So how would anybody, there's no mobile phones, there's no messaging, oh, guess what? Sari is now called Sarah. Three strangers arrive, and where's Sarah? So it wouldn't have been a known thing at that time, and Abraham would have realised, well, hang on, there's something going on here. And then verse 10 is the clincher, because he says, "I will certainly return unto thee according to the time of life, and lo, Sarah thy wife shall have a son." And Sarah heard it in the tent door which was behind him. So there's no guessing now about these men. They're important men. They're angels. And one of them is the Yahweh angel, as described in verse 1 and verse 13. So these are important people. And they're talking about Sarah and her having a child. And Yahweh had said this loud enough for her to hear particularly. He knew that she was just behind the door. And according to the time of life means the time that it takes a baby to be made, which is 9 months. So it's 9 months from now that this was going to happen. And so this compresses the few chapters beyond this, even less than a year. They're now going to happen in 9 months. That's what we're facing here. So between chapter 17 and chapter 18, 3 months has already progressed. And now all of this has to happen in the next 9 months. Now Abram and Sarah were old, advanced in years. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. So what is this telling us now? And let's just have a look at a few statistics. A few statistics that a man has pulled out, and I'll just read them. 10% of couples are infertile. A third of this is due to the men. A third of this is due to women. A third of it is due to incompatibility. And for 20% of those, this cause is still unknown. So there was a study made that women have about 300 to 400 mature eggs throughout their lifetime. By the time a woman reaches 30, nearly all of her eggs are gone for good. Women who put off childbearing for too long have difficulty ever conceiving. The study also found that women have lost 90% of their eggs by the time they are 30 years old, and only have about 3% remaining when they're 40. The quality of those remaining is not very good either, giving a much higher risk of problems. Sarah is nearly 90. Hers have stopped altogether. So, she has been barren all her life, but now there's something else. Now that she's old, her monthly cycle has ceased. Her reproductive eggs are now gone. It is now totally impossible for her to have children. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I am worn out, my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure? So here she is laughing within herself as Abraham had in chapter 17, but hers is in disbelief. She's old, as she says, which means worn out. As we have just read, she had every reason to laugh, statistically and naturally. And the odds are very much stacked against her. But there's a hint of something else here as well. My Lord is old. So what does that mean? Abraham is past having children as well. And this is supported twice in the New Testament. Romans 4 verse 19 says, I'll just read it off the slide there. Being not weak in faith and considered not his own body now dead when he was about 100 years old, neither the deadness of Sarah's womb. So Paul is telling us that it's both of them. It's not just her. So it was her all their life, but at this stage of life, it's both of them. Neither of them can have children. And Hebrews 11, therefore sprang there even of one, and him as good as dead. So he can't have children either. They both can't have children. This will really be a miracle birth by God with two infertile people. And so we think of Christ's miraculous birth, but Isaac's was just as miraculous, and in perhaps a similar way. Not quite the same, but similar. So fortunately for us, that God specialises in the impossible. And, Yahweh says in verse 13, why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I'm old? So not only does he know that she laughs within herself, but he also knows why she laughed. The motive comes out there as well. And at this stage, she would have run out from the tent. As he declares, is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son. The huge lesson here for Sarah is that nothing is too hard for God. Two infertile people will have a baby. And it's not now just, sometime in the future. We've got a specific time mentioned here. There's two time periods mentioned here. One is at the appointed time, which means the time of life, which is 9 months. So in 9 months, you are going to have a baby. And about this time next year means 1 year, which was set back in chapter 17. So the two time periods match up. 3 months ago, that was about this time next year, and now we've got 9 months. Sarah shall have a baby 9 months from now, is what they say.